Hello and welcome to Database Design Chat number 5. Today we're going to talk about what does good enough mean to you. So good morning. Yeah, it's good to have you here. Wait, or maybe good afternoon. Good evening. Does it really matter? Is it good enough just to say hello? Right? What good enough is very, very different for very different reasons. So tonight we're going to talk about that. And it's actually night here. If I refer to it as night, it looks like it's night in my office. It is. All right, brief introduction. My name all over the net is simply DRSQL. It's my Twitter handle, it's my email address, my website is drsql.org. And my link tree, which is the easiest way to find any of my links and even links to my side fun tasks, is to go to https://link linktr.ee/drsql, and you can find anything you want to know about me. All right. The thing about good enough is it needs context, right? I need to know what is good enough. How about a vehicle? I want a good enough vehicle. And, you come up with something that looks like this. Well, that'll get me places, but I didn't really specify what kind of vehicle I needed. Maybe I need to make trips back and forth to the grocery store. That may be a good enough vehicle. Is a bicycle a good enough vehicle? It is a vehicle. It possibly can get me from point A to point B well enough. But is it good enough, right? I need more context. I need requirements. We talked about requirements in previous episode. Requirements are the backbone of what becomes a specification, which what becomes what we build things. For example, a brick, not good enough. Not if you're building something. I mean, I have seen some people make sculptures out of bicycles, but more or less, that's not good enough. All right, so where this all comes from is I want to tell you a fairy tale about something that happened to a real human being somewhere, possibly. This was about 20 years ago. He at working at his job, and the boss says, I think this is good enough. We don't need to keep designing this. We don't need to keep thinking about how to build this. And I'm like, I've just come back to this company. I don't think I'm going to have to, I don't have this feeling that I'm going to be dealing with this for the rest of my life. But lo and behold, here I am 20 years later, and I'm still dealing with those mistakes because good enough wasn't defined at a proper level. What is good enough? That's what we have a lot of this database design requirements, normalization, all the topics that we'll go into over the weeks and months that I hopefully be putting this out. But it's not just something you can say, oh, it's good enough if it runs and it compiles and it seems to meet the requirements that we asked for. Does it also not meet the requirements in ways? If I build something that can carry me from point A to point B once, great, but I need to do it 100 times. And sometimes it may need to do something else. And it may need to use certain kinds of fuel because we only can get certain kinds of fuel. All those kind of details get into the picture. So we want to talk about what is good enough. Does that mean, sloppy? It's good enough. I mean, sometimes you make a sandwich and sometimes, it falls apart. I'm not putting this in a contest. It's good enough. I'm going to eat it. Totally good enough. I make tea. Sometimes it's too strong. Sometimes it's not strong enough. It's good enough. But good enough when it comes to software is really important. I can make one big blob column and store all my data in it. I can make one blob column. And that is really a database which is the worst, but also is good enough for certain cases. If you're building a database for someone to just take notes on, it might be good enough to have just one big blob and they can delimit it however they want to. You may have one. You may then go, I really like to be able to capture my notes in different days. And then you just capture a blob per day. And then you if you start down this road, even before you have any clue about how a database is designed, how a database should be, you get to the point where you go, yeah, that makes sense. I need to break things down and farther until I get to the place where I want. Good enough has different meanings to different people. And if you let someone who's not like knowledgeable about how a relational database should be built, they're going to stop at a much different level than if someone who knows what they're doing. And 20 years later, you're going to feel a lot better about it if you stick around at the same company than not have to deal with some of the mistakes that were made in the past. Because software is hard to replace, and databases are harder to replace because you've got to take all this data and then change it and put it into another database, and it's just you get stuck with things. So coming up with what good enough is very important to know the foundations of your skill. And the very next one of these topics is going to be about, what are the normal forms and why are they good and bad? And that's a tough question to someone who doesn't really know what they are and what they really mean. And so that's someone who's building the database needs to have an idea of what good enough actually is. All right. So, and let's be careful not to say you can't make it correct without making it really good enough. You can. That's totally not the question. Like I can count on my fingers and do some math, and that's good enough if I get it correct. And that if I get it correct, that's correct. But it's possibly not good enough because it needs to be faster, it needs to be cleaner, it needs to be more foolproof. I may not be able to get it right every time or something. And that may be a requirement. So we got to be careful not to let the tyranny of, get it done in as fast as possible get in the way of getting things done well enough to the point where I get a product that will be sustainable for as long as it needs to be. And you got to be careful not to buy this whole, oh, well, we're only going to be using the software for 2 weeks. And maybe 2 weeks, maybe okay. But most of the time, we're going to replace this software in about 6 months. And about 6 to 10 years later, we're still thinking, we could do that, but there are other things to do. There's bigger fish to fry. So we need to at least make sure we get things correct. And then we ought to make sure that it's good enough so that later we will not have to worry about this thing, and that it can be actually morphed into future needs, knowing that things are going to never be changing as much as you'd hope they do. All right. Again, I'm going to stress this one more time. We have a specification. Getting it correct, it should not be negotiable. Negotiating what correct is, negotiating the spec. You said we need to be able to do this, but we can't do that because it's not even possible in the realm of reality. That's one thing. Just saying, oh yeah, we can't do that. So we're not going to try, and we're not going to tell the customer. That's not a possibility. Okay. Correct enough. It's good enough. It's correct enough. Those are two different things. Good enough to me entails making sure that the software works in a way that's, future proof. It's good. Correct means it answers the question that they expected it the right way every time. Okay. So yes, this was not a deep, it's more theological in some respects than anything else. But the fact is, it's very important to understand that in your career you will be pressed occasionally to say, "Oh, just get it done. Just finish it." Every time that you get pressed to do this and you have to give in, and you will. I'm in the process of doing some of this right now, building some software that could be done so much better. It's like a third manual and it could be automated quite better. The fact is, you may get stuck doing things like that. But if you know what good enough would be, and good enough, sometimes means just getting into a certain place, getting into a certain level of goodness where you could maybe change it later, not scrimping on the bones. I mean, it's like building a house. You build a house, you might not build the best roof, you may not have the best attic, the best flooring, but if you don't have a good foundation, all that other stuff doesn't matter, because when it crumbles to the ground, it's better to crumble to the ground with a cheap house than it is anything else. All right, as usual, if you have any questions, add a comment, email me, message me, contact me anywhere you can find on that link tree. I will happily add another episode. I will happily just answer it in the location, wherever. I might even have a question and answer episode if it's useful. All right. Thank you. We really need to be careful with this concept of good enough. The thing you have to really always understand is, and I've beaten this one enough, quite, the software must meet requirements. So if you're building some software, it's got to do what it's supposed to do. No argument there. What the arguments generally come in, two varieties. They're either about look and feel, right? And that's where we, as architects, sometimes probably just shouldn't care, especially for the database architect. You probably shouldn't care how the application looks and feels, unless maybe you're an investor. But that really doesn't make that much difference. If the screen's blue, if the screen's red and green, it destroys the eyes of the viewers. That's not probably going to affect your software, your database software design. But then the real thing comes in. Are you trying to do more than the requirement state? Are you sitting down and you're going, it said all of our orders only allow one item, but we really need to allow 1 million items. We should test for that. And we should have 1 million different statuses on each one of those rows. And, if you were doing this right, you would do it this way, and you would do that. And that's where, as a person who's studied design and businesses and normalization and how things are built, gets in a lot of trouble, because we think, I know better. I know what we're going to need. And, at least 50% of the time you're right. It's going to come back and bite you. But the time for that is not at the end of the software project, or after you've gotten these requirements, you more or less agreed to do them, and you've already built the code, and you're like, I need to keep building. Right? That's not the idea. The other place is still with requirements, is requirements that aren't specific enough. Sometimes you just get build a database to save my invoices, save my ship and order products and invoice for it. And you're just like, what? I need more than that. And like, you can do it, and you make your own, software, and you go to that extra level, and you do allow for the 1 million line items, and you do test for them, and you do all those things because it's not specific enough. And then people go, well, you didn't need to do all that. So that's I want to be clear about, that it's got to do what it's supposed to do. But then we argue about the details of how it gets done, especially when the requirements don't quite say what we would hope, either because they've made choices you disagree with, or they haven't spelled it out clear enough.